Welcome, everyone, to another episode of El Nino Speaks. This evening, I'm joined by Nick of Night Nation Review. How are you, man?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Well, we first met, if you recall, during the Red Ice New Year's Eve stream, and I found your perspectives to be very fascinating. And I've listened to your show in passing even before, but it was finally great to meet you then. And
Awesome.
yeah, so tell my audience more about yourself, man.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Nick. I run a show called Night Nation Review. We basically cover nationalism and related topics. Recently, to begin, actually going back in time, I used to cover a lot more news and current events stuff. In recent times, I've kind of delved more into covering things like the history of white nationalism. I even did a series called White Nationalist Founders Series, which I'm actually pretty proud of because I think the history is very poorly understood, at least in a video format. And I thought that was something that was needed. A lot of people come into this sort of realm. They hear these names in passing, and this was myself included in the original, when I first was exposed to it. And you'd hear these names, but you didn't really know much about them. So I was kind of endeavoring to create a series that you could point people to and say, hey, check this out. Here's what some of these characters are all about. So I guess that's probably a pretty good description of what I've been up to.
That is one thing I like about your work because I come from a history background, so I always enjoy the lore of
Mhm.
political movements, especially of the white nationalist identitarian right, which I've increasingly identified with in the last 5 years because I came from more of a conventional libertarian paleo-conservative background, and then I've become just much more of an identitarian nationalist, if you will. But what got you into this type of politics, that's more
Mhm.
focused on the Jewish question, white identitarianism, and similar fields?
That's a good question. Myself included, by the way. I did come from more of that sort of libertarian, sort of conservative
Yeah, that
type of
pipeline.
realm first. Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
pipeline, right?
yeah.
Um, yeah, it was sort of a phase of things, right? It was a series of events and different things. So first of all, let's do the Jewish question first. So that idea to me was very foreign. When people would have talked about that in the past, I had the very similar kind of almost Hitler kind of reaction where I used to think it was crass. I thought that they were. I used to believe that they were simply a religion, right? I thought it was sort of pre-Christianity,
Mhm.
and I kind of saw it that way. And it really wasn't until I was arguing with somebody on Facebook one day, a very long time ago, 5, 6 years ago, maybe, and they pointed out that Karl Marx's real name was not really Karl Marx exactly, and that it was kind of like, wait, what? I think they began by saying he wasn't really German. I'm like, wait a minute, of course he is. So I kind of triggered the exploration, and once I started exploring that, of course, you know how the rabbit hole goes. You trip and fall, and down you go, and this is more and more and more information. But so I think that was the beginning of exploring that topic. As most people in this country, I grew up thinking that this was a very ugly taboo, that maybe there wasn't, that it was only about hatred or something. And as you learn more about it, you find out that that's not really the case, that there's a lot of depth to it. And there's a lot of reasons to be concerned with this particular issue, especially unchecked Jewish power that we have in America and really the whole West. As for the race thing, that was a little bit slow too. Yeah, it's interesting because I actually started college in Hawaii, which was sort of like my first glimpse into
Mm.
the race thing, because there is a very distinct kind of anti-whiteism there. Now, I met several Hawaiians that were very nice people, but there's a very large portion of them that are extremely anti-white, and they have, of course, as you're probably well aware, of this whole narrative crafted about the evil colonialist who came and stole their perfect paradise from them. And this is a very vitriolic, this anti-whiteism. So that kind of started me on the path, but it remained dormant for a very long time. And I kind of slowly started to just face facts that this was an inescapable fact of our current political situation. When the BLM thing finally kicked off, that was like the straw that broke the camel's back, because I was like, okay, well, everything I've been learning about this is actually correct. And of course, then I start researching everything, like how did integration happen in America, and you're led to believe, of course, that this is some democratic process that's people voted for and all this sort of stuff. But you realize that that's not exactly what happened. So I'd say that's probably how I got into those two things. I kind of came into this thing kind of reluctantly. I like most people, you're taught to believe that it's just this Hollywood-esque version of what it actually is. And then when we actually go into this thing, of course, you start finding out that these are just real people. They share your concerns, they share your interests, and they're not monsters. They're actually very nice people most of the time.
Yeah.
Most of them, anyway. Yeah. How about you?
Well,
Ever asked you?
yeah. So I've always had a disposition towards kind of like radical politics, and even like I never had a kind of like conservative or a neocon phase whatsoever. There was like one point before I even got political, I was kind of dabbling in Marxism after I read Capital and stuff like that, but it didn't really make me become a leftist. And then I just went on like a lot of forums, like sports forums, and I learned about libertarianism and all of that. But my dad, for example, was really politically incorrect on issues like regarding like Jews, because coming from like a very he's like a white Spaniard extraction, and there's always in those type of cultures in Latin America, especially among whites, Spaniards or like Basques or other people from the Iberian Peninsula, there is pretty strong blood memory that is very skeptical, if not outright hostile, towards Jews and organized Jewry there.
Yeah.
And people can make a lot of politically incorrect comments about them. And for me, even like throughout my journey, it wasn't that much of a leap to start questioning the JQ or start bracing more of kind of like white identitarian causes. And even like when I was a libertarian, one of the big things of what made me a libertarian was the opposition to the Civil Rights Act, because I saw it as an attack on freedom of association. And that's what kind of drew me to that when Ron Paul was talking about that, like getting rid of that so that property owners could have like the right to discriminate against who they please. But it, generally speaking, was a natural progression. I also had a lot of friends that read Culture of Critique in like the university and all of that. And eventually I started reading more of the blogs like VDare, Occidental Observer, all that. And within time, like by like 2020, I was just like fully radicalized. And yeah, it was a process, but I never really had much issues with the ideas. I didn't have like a visceral reaction to it like some people do, because I was always interacting with people that were kind of on the margin when it comes to these ideas, and it was kind of natural for me to do it. But you mentioned Hawaii, and that's kind of interesting. Wasn't Hawaii one of like the first states to really become like majority non-white?
I'm not sure. I've never really charted the demographic history of Hawaii. That's a good thing to actually do, but I would not surprise me in the slightest, because they have a very, very large Asian population, especially
Yeah,
like Filipino,
Pacific
Micronesian,
Islander. Yeah,
Pacific Islander, this sort of thing. So yeah, I don't think they were ever majority white. Actually, I think probably never were, because of
that's
that.
actually a good point.
Yeah. Trying to think of this. So, of course, Hawaii became a state, as you're sure you're probably very well aware, just because of the military base, because of Pearl Harbor. Um, Short of that, I think it probably wouldn't have happened. It's a very strange place. It's not really America, but it's not really Asia. It's sort of
Yeah,
a sort of
in the
middle
middle.
land.
Yeah,
Yeah, beautiful
yeah, it's
place. But
interesting. So you said that like the type of anti-white racism there was mostly like colonial or like anti-colonial of nature. Was it ever like very well organized, or was it just like sporadic outbursts against whites?
Oh, no, no, it's quite well organized. They have a sort of like, take back the land sort of,
Oh
I forget
wow.
what the name of it is. I believe it might be Kamaaina. I mean, that means of the land, but I can't remember what the name of their movement is. It's been about almost 20 years now, but they have a very, distinctive and I don't know if it's very well funded, actually, to be honest with you. I don't think it is. It seems pretty grassroots because of that. but they're quite active. I was a photographer at the school there in the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and I did some photography of their protests, and they would come and they would do little protests at the campus sometimes, and they're very passionate about it. I mean, they very much believe it. And they want basically Hawaii back, and there's the whole story of Captain Cook coming there, landing there, the British sailing captain. Apparently, they end up beheading him, but out of respect, they gave his head back. I guess that's the thing they like to
Huh.
say. I guess if they didn't respect him, they would have trashed the head or something. But yeah. So that's what happens, and they want to reclaim the islands. I don't think it's going to happen for them though. I think that they're too conquered, and I think this is an irony worth stating that if it wasn't a white country like America that had done this, it would have been China. China would have taken them in a heartbeat, and they probably would have been less kind. They probably would have just wiped them out.
Yeah, that's one of those things where a lot of like, especially when you look at like the history of like white colonialization, like they tend to actually preserve the cultures that are colonized, or like the slaves they bring in. Like you don't really see like the elimination of black culture in the United States, like when slaves were brought here per se. Well, you might see the elimination of kind of like the foundational black American culture because of mass migration, which is like a whole different story. But that is of a different ruling class altogether that has brought that about. But yeah, like if you look at like European colonization, for whatever its flaws it has, and I'm not really a colonialist per se, but like it really wasn't like the horror show that the legacy like court historians would like people to believe like whatsoever. I want to go to the lore now that you talk about. What was like the first kind of like piece of content or historical figure in the white nationalist scene that really interested you and made you like committed to putting out content like this on a regular basis?
Sure, I had stumbled across something. I was looking at creativity with Klassen and Matt Hale, Ben Klassen and Matt Hale,
Mhm.
and I did an episode on that, and I sort of had this like wow moment of like, you know what, this is actually something that should be a series, and it kind of was the whole like light bulb thing going off of like, okay, well, this is a big problem because when people come to this thing, they don't know where to look. They don't know what to consult. They don't know where to even start. Usually, I'm sure you're probably aware of this too. You tend to get this spattering of information from this direction and that direction, this direction, all over the place. And some of it's legitimate, some of it's probably bull. So you don't really quite know where to start. You don't know what to look at. And a lot of this time, you constantly hear these references, right, to these figures. And you hear somebody throw out like William Luther Pierce or this kind of stuff, and you don't really know who these people are. Somebody say Matt Hale, who's that? And they're trying to tell you this whole story, and because everybody has these little chunks of information and it's all very scattered up, I think it's very hard for people that are interested to just enter this thing, understand what it is that they're getting into. For one thing, some of these figures have quite checkered histories. It depends how you want to judge that. I mean, shoot, some people did real prison time for what they believed in, whether they were right or wrong. They did. Um, some people engaged in behaviors that the system certainly considers terroristic. Some people engaged in behaviors that the system definitely doesn't like, but maybe doesn't rise to that classification. I found out one thing I was very surprised in is that most of the people in the origins of WN, at least that I've covered, pretty much most of them had some kind of clan affiliation at some point. So that's interesting too. And I don't think that's as well known, at least not today. It probably was well known 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but not as much today. But yeah, that was sort of the origins of that idea. And I think that it's not quite finished as a project. I think I'm 20 deep. The last one I did was James Mason, and the one I did before that was Adolf Hitler, which I struggled as to whether I should do one on Hitler because Hitler precedes white nationalism. Really, I mean, white nationalism really was born out of a term Frank da Silva came up with when quizzed on this by a reporter, and he just like blurted it out like a meme, and they kind of ran with it ever since. So of course, that's more the branding and kind of theme of it, but I mean, in essence, it's last, it's been around forever, but the modern formation of it. So that was really interesting. I actually had an interview with Frank once, and he kind of went over the history of it. And he was talking about some of these important figures, and he was saying that it was kind of born of this like long term dialogue back and forth with these people. Like Pierce, like
Yeah.
who else is it? But Richard Butler. Who else was involved? Like Robert E. Miles, that's what I was thinking of. There's a few more figures like that, right? And he's kind of having these correspondence back and forth with these guys. They're talking about things like the territorial imperative that, the white, Caucasian, European, Aryan needs to have land. You need to have land. It needs to be established. It needs to be definitively yours, and it needs to be understood that this is on a racial basis. So, stuff like this, they were having these long-term back and forth discussions. And I guess he said that the concept had been born out of that. So I think that this is it's very interesting. I think it's a history that's not very well told. Really, it would be better if you had almost like a Europa the Last Battle style, 12-hour documentary kind of thing that kind of went over it all in one piece. And hopefully someday something like that would exist, because I think it deserves to.
Yeah, I also think too, in like a rational type of political order, you would have like universities that would have courses on this type of history of white nationalist history, just like they have courses about like the history of like certain political movements and all of that. But we don't live in that. Could you tell my audience who like Frank De Silva was? Because I think this is good, because given your expertise on this lore, I think that's where you could deliver some major value.
Sure, sure. Frank De Silva was a gentleman involved with the Bruderschweigen. What Bruderschweigen was known as the Order, I guess, by the media. That was the media term for it. That was not a term they ever used. Excuse me. So he was involved in this in the early '80s, and he was. Let's see, what else was he? So the state accused him of being the communications manager, I believe they called it. And he ended up doing, I think it was 10
You're kind of
11 years.
roboting. Yeah.
Oh, test. Let's see if that works. Test. Try again. Let's give it a second to recalibrate. Sometimes
Hold
it does
on.
that. No worries.
Yeah. Hold on a second. I think it should be fine now.
Okay,
continue.
Sure. So I was talking about Frank. So Frank was involved in this sort of thing in the early '80s, the Bruderschweigen, and what they were doing is they were trying to fight the system. They were trying to fight what they saw as an occupational government.
Yeah, continue on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and their means of doing it was basically, it sort of escalated, right? At first, they were trying to rob like pornography stores. I think was the first one. And eventually, this ended up resulting in them pulling armored car robberies, some of which were very successful. I think there was one in where was that? I think it was, I believe it was Northern California or Oregon. I forget, but they pulled one that was very successful. Now there was obviously recently a movie that came out on this exact thing called The Order. Pretty good movie actually. Not exactly accurate, but yeah, I had him come on the show, and we tried to do our best to break down the accuracies and inaccuracies of that movie. So you can find that episode on my channels. But yeah, so this was basically a resistance group in the early '80s. He had a clan affiliation in the '70s, and now after he did the time in the Gulag, um, well, he's a poet and a writer, and he's been very generous with his time. He's a really interesting fellow, because one of the things he did is something I think that all of us should do someday if we have success in this what we're doing as white advocates. He mentors the young guys. You'll see him. He goes in Twitter Spaces all the time. He talks to people like me. He tries to sort of help us through the minefield of this to some degree, and help us understand what we're up against. And it's pretty wild, man. There's a lot of risks, and there's a lot of minds and a lot of issues out there. I'm sure you probably encountered quite a few yourself. So I think that's quite an admirable thing. I really like that mentorship kind of approach. I might turn off that bell though, if you don't mind me jumping up for a second.
No, it's all good. Now, on your like history, have you covered the life of Willis Carto or Michael Collins Piper, that crowd?
I haven't, but those are two people that need to be covered.
Yeah, because they were. Now, this is where it's interesting because this scene, they're more in the questioning the Holocaust and also more focused on the Jewish question, but they did have somewhat of a rivalry with William Luther Pierce.
Mm.
And but they had like very different approaches because the Cardo and company, they had Institute for Historical Review, later on American Free Press and the Barnes Review and all of that. Like that's just much more academic and trying to challenge historical narratives. Whereas from my reading of William Luther Pierce's life, he was much more political. He was using trying to use like more conventional politics. But did based on your research, did Pierce have any rivals though in terms of his like political approach to like white nationalism and white advocacy?
He did. I'm not actually too learned on what his personal rivalries were. Actually, I think there was actually several.
Yeah.
It's funny because now when you hear about these guys now, those things have all faded away, which I think in and of
Yeah.
itself is kind of a lesson for all of us, right? That are in the thick of it. Because when you get into one of these back and forths with somebody, sometimes it seems quite heated, and it seems like, oh God, this is going to be, part of the legacy of what I'm trying to do. And ultimately, if you really succeed at what you're trying to do at all, it's gonna just fade away and no one's gonna remember it at all because it doesn't really matter, right? But I know I'm not too familiar with his rivalries. I know that he had a few people that you would think that they would get along with. I think there was a few that I remember kind of being surprised that there was rivalries there. I know that specifically with William Luther Pierce, he did not like people that were doing things as stunts, people that were doing things that were sort of lowbrow, and he actually gave several speeches towards the end of his life where he just drilled on these people, calling them clowns and this sort of stuff. And he was talking about people that just they were doing it for attention and for their own sort of self glorification, and that they brought basically a bad crowd. They attracted a bad crowd to the National Alliance, and he didn't want it. So he did a lot to try to push those people out. I think there's a lesson there too, Jose, because I think we don't just want everybody. I think we want a sort of eugenic selection process for who we want to be part of our groups.
You have to gatekeep one way or the other.
Yeah. Have you been part of any groups that have had a good gatekeeping process?
Um, I've done conventional politics before, and it is very difficult to gatekeep because you have to think about things in a multi-vector type of manner where you can have people that are very ideologically aligned, which is good because you don't want ideological subversives, but at the same time it's sometimes not enough because as you mentioned with Pierce, I actually agree with him that if you're gonna bring in people that are doing stunts, you're just gonna have a circus, inevitably. I mean, if you want to do stuff like that's like stunts, like for like cultural to create like over the top content, I mean that's your hustle. Like I won't knock you for that. But if you're running like a proper political organization that's gonna be serious about taking conventional political power, you really can't have that. And you have to have like people that are actually competent, that don't gossip a lot. If I'm not mistaken from Pierce, Pierce did not like gossiper types either. I think he said in some of the stuff, some of the speeches I've listened to, that he says that the best way to prevent internal drama with organizations is to not bring in people that are naturally smack talkers, gossipers that just cause this stuff in the first place. Like that's how you kind of prevent it. But
Mm.
generally speaking, not I'm not very authoritative on this issue about like gatekeeping org. You do have to have like certain standards and all of that. But at the same time, really it's oftentimes reflective on the leaders too. If you're very permissive in terms of what you allow and who you allow, your organization will become subverted in one way, in one shape or the other.
Well, isn't that one of our key vulnerabilities, right? Is that we put together these organizations, and they usually have the best of intentions. Sometimes they even have really good leadership, but usually what happens is a few subversives sneak in there and they start poisoning the well effectively, right? They start spreading rumors, starting fights. In the most extreme cases, maybe they'll be like, want to bring in illegal stuff into the mix to try to make it so that your organization is vulnerable to getting shut down by the authorities. So this is a big vulnerability. I mean, in some extreme cases, you actually have federal infiltration. So yeah, I mean, it's always a problem, right? It's always been a problem with white nationalism from the get go.
Yeah, I can't speak to the prevention of like feds and all of that. At times, like honestly, with politics, it is like an elite type of business where you do have to like build like a vanguard, and that means that you're gonna have to be pretty exclusionary. You have to have like a specific crop of people that are really committed to your cause, have the skills and the character to carry out this stuff. Because when you start opening it up to like more people, even if they're like supposedly your friends, if you look at like history of just like counterintelligence or infiltration by these agencies, they often pick people's friends or people's acquaintances, like some of the leaders' acquaintances of these organizations, to like flip them and subvert them. So you have to be really careful. And that's why I think it's very important to have a vanguard type of organization that is like exclusionary in nature in terms of its leadership and all of that. Now, going back to some of your research you've done, what was like the most surprising thing you've learned from like studying the white nationalist movement? Like what genuinely shocked you when you started getting into this type of stuff, like delving into the history?
I think one of the things that was really surprising is how many of the key figures in the early days were, I have to be kind of careful how I phrase this. Let's just say had OSS and intelligence connections. There are some people who read that as the whole thing's an op. I don't necessarily read that way. I read it as there were a lot of dissenters in this sort of era, right, following the Second World War, and I'm talking about some of the early guys, right, some of the very early figures, and I think that they were involved in the system. I think they saw maybe the rottenness at the center of the system and dissented. I I think that's the benefit of the doubt way to read it. The critical, skeptical, paranoid way to read it is it's all an op, right?
Yeah.
I know there are some people that do it, like Dave Riley of the Backlash said that on the Backlash somewhat recently. I happened to catch that. Yeah, I don't really personally subscribe to that. I think that you probably look. I think for any type of thing where you're going to try to do racial white advocacy on any level, you're probably going to have a few infiltrators. I think that you have to kind of expect that, and there's just all the more motive to operate in a legal framework. But I don't think that necessarily reads that because some of these people early on were, say, ex OSS people or something, that necessarily
Who
the
were some of these
entire
figures? Most notably, who were
okay.
some of these people?
Let's see. So who would that be? So right. Pretty sure Richard Butler was actually as well. What was that? Robert E. Miles was. Um, who else was? Should have had a list. Should have made a list. I didn't know you were going to ask me that. There was a few more certainly that I'm aware of. I'm sure there was a few more yet. I don't remember who else was involved there.
I'm not shocked by this because also at the time when you read, for example, the UNS review, like the archives there, UNS makes a good point that in the lead up to World War II and even up until like the early 60s, there was a class of the American, there was like a faction of the American ruling class, especially in the national security sectors, that were aware of the JQ. They knew
Mhm,
about
mhm,
disproportionate Jewish influence, and they were actually generally against the US like recognizing the state of Israel because they knew that this would be like become like a key node for the transnational criminal enterprise that is world Jewry.
mhm.
And like you had like George Kennan and even like um what's his face George Marshall as well that opposed that. And it was actually um was not, I wouldn't say like mainstream, but it was not like taboo to actually raise these questions about organized Jewry. Like the in the 30s and 40s, you had all sorts of figures from like Father Coughlin and all that.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I've enjoyed about the Un's review is that it's brought back a lot of this history and discussion that shows that these ideas were actually not that fringe and they were discussed and not censored as well.
No, no, that's absolutely true. I remember one more, Bob Whitaker, right? Who
Mhm.
was sort of a mentor for Tim Murdoch. So there was several guys like that. But no, you're right. You're right. Un's Review is also a good website too. Does he do a like a physical publication, or is it only the website? Ron Unz.
From my understanding, it's just like a website. He goes as far to like the archives of a lot of newspapers. I've seen stuff that he goes all the way back to like the 1890s, man, like
Wow.
to like preserve some of a lot of out of print publications. Like his goal is part of like his series of like revisionism is to kind of show that um that a lot of the information that's talked about in the white nationalist scene now was actually, it's not even like brand new, but
Mhm.
it was somewhat accepted by certain elements of like the elite back then. And there were mainstream journalists that would cover it. Now, obviously, it's been run out the venue, but what he points out is that this stuff was from the JQ to like the merits of like the US entering like World War II. This stuff was openly discussed, but it's obviously been memory hold because of the new ruling class we have, which is largely Jewish dominated and dominated by its loyal Shabbos Goyim, but they're Shabbos Goyim, but like that's just kind of like the nature of the beast there.
No, you're right. I think there was a lot of people that had very large audiences. I'm trying to remember the name too. There was, well, actually, probably quite a few, but there were several others as well, as Coughlin, that had very large audiences. I mean, compared to today, you're talking about millions, on the radio that would speak quite openly about issues like Jewish power and what they were doing with it, and how that involved us, including being voices that wanted to. Well, they were isolationists. They wanted to keep us out of the war. Um, I also did actually did a show on the hee haws. There was all these sort of like
Yeah.
National Socialist sympathizer radio voices in London and even some in America too. And these had pretty large audiences. It was pretty kind of wild to see because we're used to fighting this censorship thing so hard. It's sort of an uphill battle every day to try to get out any of this kind of information. So we can't imagine a world in which that's not already the thing. But I think they found out that that's the way to go for keeping us suppressed. And while they're right in terms of media, in terms of buying themselves time, which it certainly does, I think overall it's not really going to change anything. I think it's still whatever the consequences of all this are going to be, they're still going to be, and silencing podcasters and authors and this kind of thing. That's not gonna change the outcome. I don't think not substantially.
In your just study of all these figures in the white nationalist movement, have their stories or experiences actually made you change some of your beliefs throughout this process?
It's a good question. Hmm. I wouldn't say that it's made me change my beliefs. I'd say that more my experiences directly with it in the present have made me question a lot of things. Um, when I went into this, I came at this from the sort of truther angle more than from the identitarian angle.
Mhm.
And when I kind of had this presumption that everybody, or at least the vast majority of people that were involved in this, were also sort of free thinking individuals that sort of looked at things with a very critical eye. And I recently had some experiences that made me question whether that's true. I think I've discovered that, well, that there's a lot of people within this thing that are followers in a different sort of way too, and that was kind of an eye opener, I guess. So that more than anything, as far as the people founding it and starting it and being involved in it, I don't think learning about that has made me see it all that much differently. I think if anything, it's made me appreciate the current struggle more as being very parallel to theirs. Different, but parallel.
In what ways would you say that there are parallels?
Well, they did experience a lot of the same sort of battles, a lot of the same sort of street fights that would go on, a lot of the same sort of censorship issues that would go on. I mean, you could take a look at a lot of these guys who would go around and speak in auditoriums and stuff like that, and they would get censored. They would have mobs show up and threaten them with violence to shut them down. This kind of stuff. It's all very much the same stuff. I would say today it's actually the same thing, but just amplified, maybe even louder, more extreme. Since we brought up Frank De Silva earlier, I was talking to him on his show, and he was saying that we have all the same problems. It's just the same stuff they were dealing with in the 70s and 80s. It's just the same as today, but just on steroids. It's just 10 times bigger and 10 times louder and 10 times more intense. And of course, there's also, I mean, it's the same issues that are motivating it too. It's the complete degradation of our culture. It's the invasion of our country by populations that aren't welcome and don't belong here and are changing it. It's the incessant crime by certain populations, like the blacks in
Yeah.
America. It's all the same core issues. This stuff hasn't really changed at all. It's really very much the same as it was back then.
What would you say though are the key differences that we face that stand out from the challenges that like the previous generation had to confront?
Sure. So, I mean, if you take a look at somebody like Rockwell, right? Like one of the reasons they did that, I mean, he even said one of the reasons they would agitate, where he would literally dress up as, like National Socialists in the whole brown shirts and everything, would be because they wanted to elicit the attention. They wanted to provoke the media until the media had to address them and stick a microphone in their face and get some of their ideas. So we don't really have to do that anymore. I don't think. I think that this sort of agitation um, stunts, I don't think are as required. Now, don't get me wrong, you can get a lot of attention that way, and if that's like you said, if that's your hustle, God bless you, good luck. But I don't think in terms of actually getting or utilizing or steering political will, I don't think we need to do that necessarily anymore. So that's changed, and the reason is obviously because of what you're doing right here. It's the ability to self-publish that changes it a lot. The ability for you to buy a camera and a microphone and get your opinion out there, that's a huge thing. Some of these early guys like Tom Metzger, they used to have to rent a what was that public television networks access, right, to make their own show. And Metzger in particular, he had Race and Reason, and that was great. That was amazing. He would have all these guys that were involved in doing important things in those days. They would come and sit down with him in his local public television station there in San Diego. I'm not sure if they shot them all in San Diego, but they would anyway. You get the idea. And they would just have a talk show, and he would do a very good job. He'd get his suit on. He would run a very professional operation. So I think that that's improved a lot, because I'm sure that cost them an incredible amount of money. Nowadays, we can sign up with some kind of live streaming service, or Substack is pretty wild. That's a pretty cool thing. Obviously, Twitter X is a big thing under the Musk regime. It's pretty liberal and sense of free. So those kind of things I think have changed a lot from where it was back then. I think that a lot of the same core struggle things haven't. I think we should take advantage of this opportunity. We're at a unique point in history. I think the more people that know about these problems, the better off we are. And hopefully we can actually affect some change. It does remain to be seen.
Yeah.
Let me ask you though something. What do you think about the defeatist attitude? Because I think I get this a lot from people in chats and people in the environment, where they'll be like, "Oh, we can't do anything. Oh, it's over. They've got us by the balls. It's all done." do you think about that?
I'm a bit more optimistic because I think, as you noted, the self-publishing has gotten so big now with the platforms and everything that for every person that gets like nuked off a platform, there's always like 2 to 4 others that'll emerge that maybe they won't replicate fully what they were the success they were able that the original band person was able to achieve, but they'll be able to continue pushing that message and disseminating it. And that's put like the regime in a really uncomfortable position because um I think there are limits to the type of censorship that the ruling class can get away with. Um because once that power, the Jewish power becomes formalized and it becomes very clear that this is a Gentile versus Jewish struggle, the battle lines are clearly drawn and it's a matter of time before a critical mass forms. And we have the numbers. That's the thing that we do have definitively over the powers that be is that we have the raw numbers to really beat these people in a conventional battle. The problem is you have tons of cognitive pollution and artificial polarization that the that organized Jewry is able to use to break white solidarity or any movement in general that can coherently challenge them. But compared to like just my read of the history and also just compared to my time being in the political game, I see much more talk about racialism, questioning Jewish influence now than before. And I think as a lot of things are breaking down in the West, people are just going to stop talking about generic politics regarding taxation policy and all that. People are going to start talking about more existential matters. And I think it's only going to intensify.
No, that's a good question. I actually see it very much the same way. I wonder if you see this as well. I think our biggest problem is two things: is organization, and I think it's our ability to organize ourselves properly and not have that subverted. That seems to be a big trouble.
Mhm.
And the other thing is, well, I should forgot what the second thing is. I guess the other thing would be them trying to,
The
well,
organization is the hardest, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah. That's it, right? Like, how do you do that? Because so many people have taken a shot at it, and they get some people get pretty far, but there tends to be a breakdown usually at some
Mhm.
point. Either it's a personal thing, or the thing gets subverted, or something or other. How does that get achieved?
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question. I think another challenge too, and I say this as somebody that you came from a typical Republican entryist background, is the false allure of certain people going the conventional entryist political route of trying to infiltrate the GOP has been tried so many times from like libertarians, paleocons, and even some people adjacent to our circles. You're not really infiltrating the party here. That's the thing that you'll learn real quick. It's the party that ends up infiltrating you, and you get assimilated into that Borg. And um, like now, this leads to my next point here with the whole riots kicking off in LA and like
Mm,
nationwide. You are hearing conservative influencers start sounding kind of like us, and
yeah.
that is a positive change in terms of the discourse. But I have long argued this, and I've said this based on my experience doing a lot of just raw lobbying, where you have to look at the numbers of people who are actually on your side in a given legislative body or whatever. That until you see politicians actually introducing legislation or taking drastic measures to reverse the demographic debacle that we're living under in the United States. All this stuff is just hot air that these people are spewing. It's just rhetoric. It doesn't
Mhm.
manifest itself into concrete action.
No, you're right, and I have seen that. I have seen them pick up some of our talking points for sure. Yeah, even people with Charlie Kirk types, which is kind of
Yeah.
shocking. Now, of course, they obviously won't touch the JQ because they don't want to bite the hand that
Yeah.
feeds, but you know,
Yeah.
they will
That's
talk
the
about
big
like
nose exception. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. The question is like what does translate it from hot air and rhetoric to actually some kind of real action with actual consequences like legislation or this sort of thing. Um, I don't know. I mean, what do you think it is? I think it's probably some kind of critical mass where they just cannot escape it, where it becomes
Yeah.
this chorus where no matter where they go, no matter who they're talking to, it's the same kind of drum beat. I think that might be probably the answer. I'm not 100% sure, but that seems to be it. Yeah.
I tend to think it's going to become inevitable because the especially millennials and younger that have not had their minds fully infected by the Cold War greatest generation kind of mind virus.
Mhm.
It, this generational cohort has seen like the US accelerate into like this Tower of Babel, and they can't really sympathize with like these 1950s images of like cohesive societies. They can't really envision that. They've grown up in an era where things have gotten progressively worse and worse. And that's going to make people a lot more radical. That's going to make people question a lot of the post World War II mythologies, from the Holocaust to like the United States being the greatest nation on earth and all that. And
Mhm.
the whole like multiracial, multicultural cult, people will start questioning that. And I've noticed with people in like younger cohort, despite a lot of them being infected by like Judeo leftist memes, many of these people are actually tuning into our shows. They're looking at our this are looking at other content. They just can't really believe like the idea of like the US being this like exceptional polity when they can barely like afford to make rent, much less start a family, buy a home and all of that. The idea of like the whole notion of like an American dream is basically a fantasy for most people. And I think that as things get like worse, people will start looking for like not just stuff like on a spiritual basis that goes beyond like consumerism, but they're gonna start looking at their tribe, start looking at their like identity as something to fall back on. Because once you lose a lot of like the trinkets and all that, and you can't really enjoy like a consumerist lifestyle, you're gonna go back to first principles, and it's gonna become like it's a biological type of awakening. It's a form of atavism that you're seeing that's being tapped. That a lot of people are going to become more atavistic in how they will organize, and I think it's inevitable as like the U.S. white European population dwindles that people will become more race conscious because we live in a what is for all intents and purposes a multiracial open air prison, and as those dynamics just intensify, it's going to be like like we were talking about before the show, before the recording. It's going to be like the a macrocosm of like, the American prison system, where people there they organize on explicitly racial grounds. So that's going to happen, as extreme as it may sound. People have to kind of brace themselves because you just cannot deny biological reality at this point.
Yeah, well said. No, I think that's exactly it. I think that there's been a lot of these kind of jolts of awakening recently. The riots that are going on at present in LA are a good symptom of what we're discussing, but also things like the stabbing of Austin Metcalf and then the Shiloh Hendricks
Oh yes.
afterburn to that. That was a really big thing too. You know, for anybody who's not aware, I somehow obviously Austin Metcalf gets stabbed in the chest by Carmelo Anthony. Carmelo Anthony, the alleged murderer, then goes on to collect, I think it was a little over $500,000 as almost like a paycheck for murdering this white guy. Another, well, no, white kid, I should say. They were both, I believe they're both still underage technically. But he then, yeah, so this rewarded a murder, basically, or an alleged murder. And so then, of course, you know, what was that? 3 weeks later, I think, a woman named Shiloh Hendricks, of course, she drops the N bomb on a little kid. a Somalian that they said was a 5-year-old. He looked like more like he was 10. He was rifling through her diaper bag, allegedly, according to her, trying to steal something. She calls him a little N, get away from me, right? I don't know what the speech controls are here, but yeah. So yeah. So anyway, with that, they try to cancel her. Some Somali who I guess turns out to allegedly be some kind of sex offender after the fact is filming her, post this online. They try to cancel her. This backfires and basically almost makes her a millionaire. I think she's at 800,000 right now,
Yeah.
and she's got the money too, so it's real. So that's a really wonderful thing because you're seeing a backlash. You're seeing that process of them being able to work up an outrage mob to try to destroy someone's life over something as trite as a naughty word. That's backfiring on them now, and I think that's a really interesting development.
Yes. The case of Carmelo Anthony, that actually took place kind of close to where I grew up at
Really
in the North Dallas area, and
cool.
that is actually kind of scary because Frisco is a very upper class type of exurb because Dallas is one of like the embodiments of like white flight. It's one of like the most
Mhm.
sprawled out metro areas where
It's massive.
people will go out of their way to be like 35 to 50 minutes away from Dallas, like the city center, to basically escape diversity, aka the non-white blobs there. But
Mhm.
even then, they couldn't even escape. Like Austin Metcalf couldn't escape that in Frisco, and that's one of like the dangers too, because Texas being a Republican state, there's still a lot of these Republican states that are trending non-white, and Texas, which is already from some figures I've read, is majority non-white. These states are still very much subject to the dangers of living in a multiracial polity, and as a result you're going to see a alarming degree of interracial violence, and that's going to have to require people to like start thinking beyond like the two-party system, because Texas and California, while they're like on different sides of the political aisle from like the partisan basis, demographically, they're going in very similar directions where they will be unrecognizable within 30 years. And should these trends hold? And like the case of California, like what you're seeing there is basically like a fallen like state. It looks like a foreign territory at this point that has been captured by by foreign interlopers. But it serves as a lesson that being wedded to mass migration, legal and illegal, it's a recipe for disaster, and it will make your once great states look like a incoherent Tower of Babel.
No, absolutely. What's happened to California is an absolute this is tragedy. That might be one of the more beautiful states in the country, and it's I believe it was in the early '60s. You know, you're still talking about 95% white, something like this.
Mhm.
Now it's LA is 36%. So last I checked, so
Yeah.
that's devastating. Like that's no longer America as we've come to understand it our entire lives. And these changes happen fairly fast. I mean, obviously, the Reagan amnesty kicked off a lot of this trend in a big way because he basically gifted amnesty to I don't even
Mhm.
know how many Mexicans and other individuals that came over the border. That was a major hit. But I mean, just looking at the footage. I mean, going to YouTube and check, California early '60s, California at present. It looks like an alien planet at this point.
Oh,
It,
100%.
it's tragic, it's tragic. You see what it was in the '60s. It was like a white man's paradise. It's no wonder that it took on that mythological kind of notion and reputation among people because it really was this amazing place, I think, for a period of time. I think that's the tragedy. I think that's what people wish to recapture. That does bring up a great question. Do you think that there is a way to actually reverse these trends? Because I don't see a politician being allowed to. I think if they step forward and try it, they're going to be shut down pretty hard. I mean, even
Yeah.
Trump. kind of minor pushes are just like hair on fire response.
Yeah, I've talked about like a so-called Reconquista model where you're gonna people in the US that want to preserve its white European culture, they have to brace themselves for like a long slog of like a struggle to retake back these territories that have effectively been captured and expropriated from them by interlopers, because you just don't have a political class that understands what like the situation we're in, because you can't be talking about this stuff in terms of like tweaking the immigration system, like making it easier for illegal migrants to come in and all this stuff. You have to do like the immigration moratoriums. You have to actually take on big business as well, which is not going to sit well with a lot of people that come into this movement or adjacent spheres with conservative, libertarian, or free market priors. This is not going to fly. You're going to have to like start embracing collectivism, not just like on your ethnic, racial grounds, but also in some instances economic grounds. And then the organizational question too. This will require people to start clustering together, because it's one of the big challenges of the U.S., and I've argued this too, is suburbanization will very much has a ruling class component. Like you have people like Robert Moses and I forget was his face, Levitt, two Jews that really promoted this type of suburbanization model as a way to prevent the like white political blocks from forming, because one of the foundations of like white political power, and as you saw with the NSDAP in Germany, was that people could like form political parties in their neighborhoods, like in their bars, like linking up together without having to like venture 1 hour away from like a suburb to like the city center. People could like organize well. And even to this day, you look at like Europe, like a lot of these European populist parties, they can form really fast because there's always like there's the right-wing constituencies are still largely based in the cities despite all like the diversity. And like you can see like in Ireland, where whenever there's some type of migrant crime kicks off, a whole mob of people, like 300 to 400 people in that city center, just go in and just like go hands on and like starts like fucking shit up, if you will. But like, it's a lot harder in the U.S., but people are gonna have to find ways. Like I've read this stuff about how people will go to like the inner Northwest, like Idaho and all of that, but there's gonna have to be multiple strategies. Like you can't be atomized, because the more atomized you are, the easier it is for these people to just make you become politically irrelevant and useless.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great point. There is some success stories. Another one I've gotten into quite a bit is Ozarkia. You heard much about Ozarkia?
I've heard about that. I don't know much about it though. Can't speak about it.
Sure. So kind of dip into that for a minute. Ozarkia specifically is a project of Billy Roper and his Shield Wall Network. He's got quite the jacket by the ADL. they love him. But so he wants to make a white ethno state, a seedbed ethno state is what he calls it. And he's gotten quite a few white families, white people, white nationalists, et cetera, to move to this area in this is the northern Ozarks on the Arkansas, Missouri border. And I think he said it's 96 contiguous counties, I believe, that are 90+% white. He's got this little area. Now, of course, it's sort of an informal settlement, I guess, if you will. But he's aiming to do this.
It's a start.
Yeah, it's a start. And one of the successes they've had is when the system has tried to go in and say install some low income housing, and we all know what that means. They've been actually able to put the pressure on them and just go up there. And because they have these local connections, because they don't agitate the local population, but instead they relate to them like like normal people would. They've made these connections, and they were able to put local pressure, and they're able to reverse these things. And it's pretty amazing. The last one I did with Billy Roper, actually, he was telling the story at the beginning of how they did that. They went in there and they pressured their council people, and they changed it. They got it shut down. In fact, the low income housing project that they wanted to set up, they went as far as to have, I believe it was George Floyd's uncle come in as some sort of like mascot for this whole thing. And that's kind of,
Wow.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah. That went over the top, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
but it's a white pilling story of some some modicum of success, and kind of, it's a great model. If it works, right? So I think part of why it works though is because they didn't just show up there and fly some banners and say, "We're here now, screw you, we're doing it our way." They
Mm.
they, they set themselves up. They became part of the community over decades, and it's an authentic thing. And the people there, the regular, average, everyday working people who live there, know these people, and they see them at the supermarket, and they see them at the gas station, and they talk to them, and it's that actual normal sort of real life connections that are built, I think, that actually do have some power. Now, this is not appealing to a lot of people. A lot of people don't like this because a lot of people in the dissident space, they want rah, 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 marches, banners, boots on the ground. They want some kind of fireworks, right? They want something exhilarating. And, community building isn't necessarily exhilarating. Sometimes it's just a slow process, but it's very optimistic to show that it can be done.
Yes, a lot of really effective politics. It's done behind the scenes or in an inconspicuous manner. It's not always like the bells and whistles and like the theatrics and like the explosiveness. It's oftentimes quiet and modest, but you have to experiment with everything. Anyways, I think this is a good place to wrap
Absolutely.
up the conversation, Nick. But before we leave, go ahead and plug your content and any other projects you're working on.
Sure, sure. You can find me at Night Nation Review on most things. If you type that in, usually you'll find it. I'm on Rumble. I'm on Odyssey. The short link is nightnation.live will take you to my Rumble. Nightnation.review will take you to my FTJ. At Real Night Nation on Twitter. I've got a Substack I'm starting. I'm going to rebrand it though. It's currently labeled Helix Division, but I'm going to change it. So that's my project. So thank you for having me on, Jose. I'll have to come. You'll have to come on mine sometime soon.
For sure, man. I look forward to that. And to
Yes.
my audience, thank you again for tuning in. And with that, El Nino has spoken.
Thank you.
All right.